Was it you who also had a piece of wood?
Yes, it was.
Number 50.
4. This piece of wood is all black.
The history of the Jewish people is a story of dispersal. As they gradually settled throughout the ancient world, Jewish communities left traces of their presence, which have now been revealed by archaeology. Since the beginning of our time, Jewish people have lastingly established themselves in the societies of the East and West, both in cities and the countryside. Thanks to archaeology, the Jewish presence in Europe during the Middle Ages and earlier is slowly coming to light through Jewish quarters, synagogues, ritual baths, but also cemeteries and funeral steles. The remains discovered by archaeologists helps complete the work of historians. Together, they draw a new portrait of these long-forgotten communities. The oldest archaeological finds revealing Jewish presence in the Jordan Valley date back to the early 1st millennium BC. Thanks to a multitude of sites uncovered around the Mediterranean, we know that Jewish communities existed and settled in the area for long periods of time. They were large enough to construct buildings, the remains of which have stood the test of time. In Dura Europos, Syria, a synagogue with beautiful paintings was discovered, reflecting a rich and well-established community along the Euphrates River. After founding important communities in the Eastern Mediterranean, with Greek as their language of trade, the Jews settled in the west of the Roman Empire. In Rome, in the heart of the Eternal City, a unique site suggests the Jews were able to live in the city peacefully, as they buried their dead alongside the Christians. Discovered in the mid-19th century, the Vigna Randonini catacombs are a huge network of underground tunnels used by Christians at the start of the 1st millennium. Researcher Elsa Lorenzi has worked extensively on this exceptional site.
The discovery was a big surprise because it was previously believed that these catacombs were exclusively used by Christians. In truth, the large painted menorahs and inscriptions provide immediate proof that this catacomb was Jewish. The term catacomb comes from the Greek katakombi, or Latin kumba, which means cave or quarry. It also means near the caves and near the quarries. These are graves dug into the rock, but that doesn't mean they were originally meant for burials. The inscriptions in the Jewish catacombs were in Greek and Latin, rarely in Hebrew. And when they were in Hebrew, it was just a few words. Shalom, for example. This leads us to believe it was a very integrated community that practiced the language of the place in which it lived. But it was also very mobile, because the world of the Roman Empire was bilingual. I also think it was a diasporic community that moved and traded.
The Jewish catacombs of the Vigna Randonini, much like the Christian tombs, are ornately decorated. The ceilings and walls feature various decorations, like mythical birds, bouquets of flowers, and ornate medallions. There are even depictions taken from the pagans: a winged victory, a cherub in flight, and fish. These decorations violate the prohibition for Jews to represent living beings, demonstrating that Roman Jews were deeply imbued with a Latin culture.
I think they were a very integrated community. In Rome, the Jewish community dates back to at least the 2nd century BC. In the 1st century BC, Jews received special treatment from Caesar, who granted them a series of privileges. They benefited from measures aimed at protecting them in one way or another. We know that Caesar was very loved by the Jews. When he was assassinated, historical sources claim the Jews went to the Forum to mourn him.
According to writer Flavius Josephus, a Romanized Jew from the 1st century AD, some 30 to 40,000 Jews were present in Rome at that time. They were mainly located in Trastevere, on the right bank of the Tiber River. It was a prosperous, well-integrated community whose worship was perfectly tolerated. Nearby, in Ostia Antica, one of Italy's most beautiful and extensive archaeological sites, are the remains of a vast synagogue on the south side of the city. Excavations show it was active from the 1st to the 4th century AD. Written records reveal there were many Jews in this port city who traded by sea with the rest of the Mediterranean. The extraordinary expansion of the Roman Empire lasted until the end of the 5th century, reaching as far as northern Europe. Along with Roman armies, many travelers, merchants, and administrators moved north along the Roman rivers and roads. Among them were Jewish merchants. But in Western Europe, and in France in particular, there are few traces of this ancient presence, and its existence is largely ignored. As a result, any object found and identified as belonging to the Jewish world is a major discovery. In Paris, at the Museum of Art and History of Judaism, a beautiful collection of Jewish funerary steels is on display, along with other objects unearthed by archaeologists. Museum director Paul Salmona actively supports research in Judaism archaeology. Today, he is examining the inscription on a small stone stele found in Auch, in the south of France.
That's a menorah with 7 branches. It isn't simplified, it actually has 7. And then there's a palm branch, a lulav, which was used for the celebration of Sukkot.
Reading the steles always provides valuable information about the deceased and their ancestry. The large steles on display at the museum come from a medieval cemetery on Rue de la Harpe in Paris.
Here's a beautiful Hebrew inscription that says, "This is the funeral stele of our master Rabbi Solomon, son of our master Rabbi Judas, who transitioned to the Garden of Eden on the Sabbath of the Korah Pericope, in the Jewish calendar year of 5041. May his memory live on in the world. May his soul be bound in the bodies of the living." What's obviously spectacular is the size of the stele. The style is austere, which is typical, as Jewish funeral steles didn't feature any iconography at that time. Nevertheless, it's a very sumptuous stele that was clearly made for a prominent personality of the Parisian Jewish community.
Paul Salmona leads an active community of diverse scientists. They're interested in the archaeology of Judaism as a new source of knowledge.
The history of Jewish communities in the Western world during the Middle Ages is extremely rich and very well documented. And yet this history is not well known. Maybe because the history of the Jews, in France at least, is not used to feed the national narrative, or what we call the national myth. As far as the history of Jews is concerned, we still pay special attention to the dark moments, the dramatic, tragic times that sometimes overshadow the less tragic moments. This potentially makes Jewish people harder to understand for the general public.
The history of the Jews on European soil is rich, complex, and composed of long periods of peaceful living among the Christians. At the turn of the year 1000, European towns and villages were built around Christian churches, forming a landscape that's still familiar to us today. But the Jews played an important role, and traces of their presence can still be found in the very center of medieval cities. Excavation after excavation, archaeologists have demonstrated that the Jews settled among the Christians, with the two communities living side by side for long stretches of time. In Rouen, the 1976 discovery of an important medieval monument under the courtyard of the courthouse kicked off a new field of research in France, the archaeology of Judaism. Claude de Mecnem works for the National Institute of Preventative Archaeological Research. To him, the Rouen building raises many questions.
The functional analysis of this building really has us puzzled. Some people think it could have been a synagogue. Others think it was a Talmudic school, a place of teaching. Of course, this stone monument is embedded with memories. Stone records everything it undergoes. When a stone building has been exposed to something like a fire, it can be seen, which is the case here. When we see that a building used by the Jewish community suffered a major fire, it evokes the destruction of the synagogues and the evictions that took place, which are reported in certain historical sources.
Maison Sublim, as it's called, is around 130 square meters, but only the lower level remains. The room is lit by 4 basement windows on the north face. However, the building's remains reveal no trace of a niche on the east wall, which is typically where a holy arch housed the scrolls of the Torah.
This certainly represents a turning point in the archaeology of Judaism, because this monument is of considerable importance. It's the oldest preserved Jewish monument in all of France.
Jacques-Sylvain Klein fought for many years to open Maison Sublim to the public.
The discovery of this monument was indicative of a considerable Jewish presence in Normandy. We've discovered 180 settlement locations throughout the region, whether in large cities, small towns, and even in the countryside. This means that the Jews were not only merchants and financiers, as commonly believed, but they were also farmers, ranchers, and craftsmen. The Jewish quarter in Rouen, located in the heart of the city, was a stone's throw from the town hall, close to the cathedral, and fully integrated with the rest of the city. Presumably, there were even properties that were jointly occupied by both Jews and Christians. This building was quickly identified as Jewish because of the inscriptions that were found on the walls. There were 16 of them. The most interesting inscription found in Maison Sublime says, "Let this house be sublime," with "for eternity" being implied. This inscription has led to many discussions about whether this building was used as a synagogue or whether it was perhaps a rabbinical academy.
The inscription that gives the building its name is a quote from the Book of Kings in the Hebrew Bible. This would tend to indicate it was a religious building.
The reopening of Maison Sublime should allow us to have a much clearer view of this medieval Judaism that is completely ignored. There was a very recent symposium called Judaism, a blind spot in the national narrative. And that's precisely what needs to be filled in. I think many people will discover this medieval Judaism in Rouen with astonishment. There were periods, especially in the 13th century, when the Jews went through difficult situations. There was a rise in persecution that culminated in the expulsion of 1306 by Philip IV. But for a very long time, Jews and Christians cohabitated, and the city of Rouen is absolutely proof of that.
Our mental construct depends in large part on the monuments in our environment. What we tell ourselves is influenced by our architectural environment, and it fundamentally helps shape our mental perspectives. This is believed by sociologists, philosophers, and historians alike. That means that when this building is reopened to the public, the people who grew up in the urban setting around it will have that knowledge and they will assimilate it. And when we talk to them about contemporary Judaism, which is generally addressed through the Nazi genocide most of the time, they will also have a vision of Jewish communities that were mixed with Christian communities in the Middle Ages. They'll also know that Christians and Jews lived together peacefully before the royal expulsions. Ultimately, this building reflects a common, shared life experience that is fundamentally part of the discussion of our origins.
Although the heyday of medieval Jewish culture in France was in the 12th and 13th centuries, the presence of Jews in Roman Gaul dates back to the start of the Christian era. Arriving from the Mediterranean, the Jews settled in the south of Gaul and along the main river routes from the Rhone to the Rhine. Archaeology has revealed a few rare traces of this ancient presence, which can be counted on one hand. An oil lamp depicting a 7-branched candlestick from the 1st century BC, found in Orgon in the Bouches-du-Rhône. a sarcophagus discovered in Arles in 2009, bearing the inscription of Pompey the Jew in Latin. A ring in the name of Astor, dating from the 4th century in Bordeaux. The funeral stele of 3 children from the same family, buried in 689 in Narbonne, which bears the Hebrew inscription, Peace upon Israel. And the aforementioned funeral stele of Péléguer, found in Auch, which dates from the 7th century. Finding traces of the Jewish presence is painstaking work, and each discovery is a hard-won victory. Here in Châteauroux, Philippe Blanchard, an archaeologist at INRAP, excavates a Jewish cemetery from the Middle Ages.
Is that the first?
I think it's... Let's see. I think it's the right upper facet.
To conduct his analysis, the archaeologist mainly relies on the absence of identifiable objects other than bones. According to Jewish law, the deceased are buried without any objects or jewels.
In all the graves I've excavated, except one in 1997 where we came across a small belt buckle, we've never found anything. Generally, in Jewish cemeteries, it's very rare to find any object or furnishings that were left there or worn by the deceased. Similar to the Christians, there's a certain humility in the idea of meeting the Creator, so the bodies are usually bare.
Identifying a Jewish cemetery depends on a set of rather tenuous clues. It is known, for example, that graves are almost always facing east, and that their location is never reused for other burials.
The Jews believe in the resurrection of bodies, which means the body must remain entirely intact so that it can be resurrected and revived. That's very different from Christian beliefs. For Christians, the body is buried, and it's just an empty shell. What's of interest to the Christian is the soul, which they believe rises to heaven, leaving behind a body that's nothing but a meaningless shell. Christians don't hesitate to dig up old tombs and move the bones, as it doesn't matter to them. That's a key difference with the Jewish religion.
In Châteauroux, as in most of France's medieval Jewish cemeteries, the steles were sold by the crown after the Jews were expelled from the Kingdom of France in 1306 and 1394. The names of the deceased will probably never be known. To refine our knowledge of these communities, archaeologists rely on epigraphy, the science of inscriptions. Reading engraved texts is an arduous discipline, as it's rare to find any steles in one piece. Historian Sonia Felous is now studying an important set of Hebrew funerary steles, currently housed in the Ouvre Notre-Dame Museum in Strasbourg.
I came to Strasbourg to work, as I have been doing for over a year, on Hebrew epigraphy. There's finally been a sort of opening up to the field of Jewish archaeology in France, so there's a momentum for research opportunities. I've come to study these individuals. Who were the Jews who lived here? What were their names? How did they die? What were the names of the women and the names of the men? Using the stones is a textual quest to learn who the Jews from the Middle Ages were and what their culture was about. We see, for example, that women had names in the local language, and that there were specific things among the Jews of Strasbourg that differentiated them from the Jews of Paris. It's proof that there was also a local microculture, local micro-traditions, and ways of writing their epitaphs that were not the same for all Jews in the Kingdom of France. It helps us understand the peculiarities of these groups, which were unique because they were Alsatians. They generated their own traditions that were specific to their group as Jews in Alsace, which proves there was no uniform Jewish culture across French territory.
Around the 11th century, France became a flourishing pole of Jewish culture, housing communities influenced by Spanish Judaism in Provence and Languedoc, along with Jews closer to German communities in the north. One of the most important representatives of Judaism in Europe at that time was Solomon, son of Isaac the Frenchman. Called Rashi, he was the most famous rabbi of the Middle Ages, and his monumental work was written in the Champagne region. His commentary on the Bible and the Talmud, a collection of the teachings of the great rabbis of antiquity, is still in use in Jewish communities around the world. Paradoxically, in France, his name is absent from the history books. In Troyes, a Rashi house was reconstructed in the district where a great master lived and worked a millennium ago.
The 11th century was a turning point for the Talmud of Babylon, and that's when Rashi played a fundamental historical role. Through his immense work, his immense toil, you could say, he made it possible to spread the Talmud more widely, to make it known, to bring it into the lives of Jewish people and into the practice of Judaism in the West. Rashi was a mine of knowledge for the langue d'Oil, which was the vernacular at the time when Rashi lived. The literate Jews knew Hebrew. Those who went to school learned the Hebrew alphabet exclusively, but obviously in everyday life they spoke the language of their country. It is often said that Rashi was the first French-language author ever, simply because of how long ago he did his writings.
This period of history was decisive for Judaism and the evolution of Talmud commentary. Rashi was at the origin of a renowned school, that of the Tosafists, or commentators. His commentary on the Talmud, written in Hebrew but peppered with thousands of words in ancient French, is still in use in Jewish communities around the world, even though his name is totally ignored in France's history.
Traditionally, Judaism produced thinkers and led to schools. Long before the founding of universities in the West, there were so-called Yeshivas, institutions of higher education, which men could access starting at a certain age. One began by studying the Torah, and then the corpus was generally expanded to the Talmud. Judaism places great importance on studying, because Judaism is a religion that becomes increasingly demanding based on texts and the knowledge of extremely complicated, voluminous texts, which are very elaborate and ambiguous. Practicing Judaism is demanding and requires a lot of self-sacrifice and much study. The study of Judaism isn't something one can just improvise.
Texts and archives have provided a vast amount of knowledge of the history of Jewish thought. The Jews played an absolutely essential role in the construction of Western philosophy. educated Jews were polyglots and translated several languages. In the medieval West, they contributed to knowledge of the Hebrew Bible and to the spread of Arab culture, itself an heir to ancient Greek culture. The Mikvah, a Jewish ritual bath from the 12th century, discovered in the Rue de la Barralerie in the 19th century, is proof of the cohabitation between Jews and Christians in the Middle Ages in Montpellier. Michael Iancu is a doctor of history and a specialist of the Jews of Provence.
Jews were indeed multilinguists, translators, philologists, and scholars. They translated from Arabic and Hebrew, which are Semitic languages, into Latin and the vernacular Occitan language. You had Jews who knew the Semitic languages and also Occitan, and you had Christians who knew Occitan and Latin. That's how many important works from the Jewish and the Arab Muslim worlds were translated into the Latin through Occitan. The mikvah is an essential part of Jewish spiritual life. Observant Jews visit it regularly to go from a state of tumah, or impure, to tahara, or pure. The men also participate, albeit less frequently, since they have no monthly cycle. But on the eve of major celebrations of the Hebrew lunar calendar, you would have undressed in this room, then immersed yourself with 7 blessings, and then exited. It's a rebirth, and during conversion, you must go through the mikvah. It's a jewel of Romanesque art, objectively and subjectively, and it's one of the oldest religious monuments along with the crypt of Notre Dame. The Jews have been around since the Gallo-Roman era. There's a lot of talk about Rome, Athens, Jerusalem, the Euro-Mediterranean heritage. The Jews are part of the history of France and Europe. They paid a heavy price due to medieval Christian anti-Judaism, but they also contributed a lot. Judaism has brought much to Europe, to the old continent. Conversely, the fate of the Jewish people would have been quite different if they had remained on their original land.
We know a fair amount about the history of the Jews in Europe, but traces of their presence in the city's landscapes are rare and undisclosed, leading to a huge memory gap. That's why archaeology is so important. The stone brings back to life memories and a forgotten past, and offers a clearer picture of how the Jewish and Christian communities actually lived together, and not in 2 separate worlds, as is often believed.
So, Paul, do we agree that Jewish archaeology in France has a bright future?
Only if there's a real vigilance, which is the key principle of archaeology, at sites where we presume there was a significant Jewish presence. But that's not true of all medieval cities in France. When we take inventory of all the Jewish streets and their medieval, Alsatian, or Occitan variants, there are actually hundreds of them. So, if we are attentive, we'll find remnants in almost every city and large town. In France, I think we lack a large research program that would involve archaeologists, historians, archivists, and all the researchers who work on topography of medieval cities to identify the full potential of this medieval Jewish heritage. It was obviously anonymized with the evictions, since any building that was not abandoned was transformed into something else. So we no longer know which ones were medieval Jewish buildings.
The
like the newfound appreciation of the Mikvah in Montpellier, preserving medieval Jewish heritage in French cities is of utmost importance for the future of the archaeology of Judaism. For the time being, this will depend mainly on local elected officials and the funding they provide to preserve the various sites. Saint-Paul-Trois-Châteaux is one of the few French cities working to officially designate a medieval Jewish quarter. The project slowly came together thanks to the street named Rue Juiverie, the excavation of a mikvah by Claude de Mecnem, and the presence of a holy arch, beautifully carved in stone. By appropriating and rehabilitating the homes of the Jewish quarter, the city seeks to create a unique French destination. Claude de Mecnem met with Mylène Lert, who's in charge of the development of the old Jewish quarter.
Since you came with your team, the municipality has bought the last parcel of land in the area with the intent of rehabilitating this cultural part of the city. As you know, we are really in the heart of the city of Saint-Paul-Trois-Châteaux. The Jewish quarter was established north of the ancient city next to a gate, which is quite important, and in the heart of the medieval city, between the Episcopal Palace and the site of the cathedral. So this is genuinely a perfect example of a Jewish settlement in medieval times.
All this data really makes it possible to recreate a classical religious complex organized around a large courtyard with distribution systems and the synagogue being close to the mikvah.
Revealing the Jewish presence in the heart of French medieval cities is still in the early stages. But elsewhere, in Germany, one of the largest Jewish heritage projects is coming to light. In downtown Cologne, a truly exceptional museum project is currently under construction. In the very heart of the city, in the town hall square, excavations that spanned more than 50 years have revealed one of the largest medieval Jewish quarters ever discovered in the Western world. What has re-emerged is an entire ancient network of buildings, of which only a few graceful walls remain. These last vestiges of an extensive Jewish quarter were unearthed during a dramatic moment in the city's history. Cologne was almost entirely razed by Allied bombings at the end of World War II. In the town hall square, the origins of the city reappeared. These included a Roman praetorium, the governor's residence, and an extensive medieval Jewish quarter, with the remains of many buildings, along with a large number of objects. This major site was excavated in the 1950s by archaeologist Otto Doppelfeld. Today, Thomas Otten is leading one of the most ambitious museum projects in Europe to honor Jewish heritage, accompanied by archaeologist Gary White. With the help of architects and engineers, they designed a pathway through the ruins that explains and highlights the meticulous work of the archaeologists.
And when we go to the south,
the innovative concept of the future museum is to make visitors understand how archaeology nourishes knowledge of the past by completely immersing them in the old Jewish quarter.
Rises up to the end of the...
From the excavations, we have a very clear picture of the Jewish quarter, where we have, of course, the main buildings as the synagogue and the Mikvah and the house, the so-called Tanzhaus for the community, which laid in the center of the quarter, and a little bit aside other public buildings and private buildings. And one of these public buildings is also the hospital. So we know for this very first phase of the Jewish quarter there was an hospital. And that is also a sign of prosperity and of a huge quarter with good contacts to other medieval centers in Germany and also in Europe.
Like many settlements in Europe, the Jewish quarter is located near the cathedral, a testament to the long-standing Jewish presence and the protection that local authorities offered the community. The medieval Jewish quarter adjoins even older ruins that date back to the Roman period of the city. The Jews probably followed the Roman armies at the time when Cologne was founded by Emperor Agrippa in the 1st century.
Cologne was a very big city. Already in Roman times, it was a large city, and that remained throughout the Middle Ages. It became a center of trade. The position on the Rhine was very fortunate for trade, and it communicated very well through the Roman roads with the land behind the city. First of all, Doppelfeld excavated the Praetorium in 1953, and he had the idea then of building a museum that would be open to the public, but underneath the ground, underneath the roads. He then, later in 1956, excavated the synagogue and the mikveh. The idea was born then, or the vision was born then, to connect these two areas, the Jewish quarters with the Roman Praetorium. And we are now carrying out this vision from this time and making it reality now.
In Cologne, the remains of the district are substantial, and many buildings are still present. Here stood a bakery. Further were a butcher shop and a leather manufacturer. The museum aims to plunge visitors directly into the daily lives of these communities. It will also show how reconstruction works, using a few elements of the remaining buildings to create an extremely realistic representation of the size and majesty of their former version. An image that's a far cry from the dark and unsanitary ghettos often associated with Jewish quarters.
We found a lot of interesting things on this excavation. One of the major things we found were the slate tablets which the Jewish children and students used to write on. And we find several examples of drawings on these tablets. We also find alphabets, we also find lists of goods or small sums of money being paid for something, we don't know what, but very small sums of money. We also find stories written there, translations. There is some German writing, but most of it is Hebrew. I don't know of any other place where there's such a lot of Hebrew writings been found.
highlighting the Jewish presence in the heart of medieval cities helps recall the history of these communities. Archaeological discoveries have improved our knowledge of European Judaism since antiquity and indicate its very ancient place in the Middle Ages, up to the expulsions all across Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries. In France, throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, the Jews faced increasing persecution and restrictions imposed by the Capetian kings. In 1394, the last Jews were driven out of the kingdom by Charles VI, and the crown seized their property.
Je crois que pour essayer de comprendre la complexité de l'existence,
I believe that in order to understand the complexity of a minority's existence, like the Jewish minority in the West, throughout the centuries, and especially in the Middle Ages, we should stop trying to focus on periods of appeasement on one hand, and periods of disasters, massacres, and violence on the other. The Christian West, despite the permanent anti-Judaism of medieval centuries, allowed the Jews to endure, to live, to exist. What does it mean to live among Christians when you're a Jew? That means being able to practice the profession you want, being able to borrow and lend money. It means being able to buy your own house and your own land, be a farmer, buy cattle, go to markets, and also engage in a whole range of trades, including artisanal trades in the field of production. All of that obviously leads to the sharing of daily life and more or less friendly relations with one's neighbors. That's how you could describe the daily relations between Jews and Christians in the centuries our sources have written most about.
Today, the archaeology of Judaism is still a budding field of research with limited means. But the collection of research findings by a few passionate specialists has greatly contributed to our knowledge of the life of these communities on European territory from antiquity to the present day. It is their hope that this knowledge will help transform how Jews are represented in European history across the ages and restore their rightful place in our shared history.